Hello, everybody. Today we have a special guest. His name is Tavo Abri, and we are going to have a discussion on Paulogia's minimal witness hypothesis for the resurrection. The question is if this is a good hypothesis a good naturalistic hypothesis that can account for the resurrection data. So, Professor Tavo, do you want to introduce yourself and your channel?
Sure. First of all, thanks so much for having me on, Juan. You've got a really fantastic channel. You've had a lot of folks on your channel that I really, really massively admire. And for those who haven't seen that many of Modern Atheism's videos, they're really fantastic. They're really wonderful, really great discussions. So I'm really, really very pleased to be on here. I'm happy to tell you a little bit about myself. I got interested in the historicity of Jesus maybe about 2 or 3 years ago. And I started a YouTube channel just a few months ago, so we're a relatively new channel. I'm a university professor. I'm theologically uncommitted, and I sort of try to ask theological questions and try to answer those questions in a way that is scholarly and academic. I don't have any theological credentials. I absolutely don't have any theological authority. I'm not a minister. I'm not a pastor. What my field is in the sciences, but I am in my own field an editor of a scholarly journal, and also I'm one of the most prolific manuscript reviewers in the history of my field. And I'm actually on the masthead for the main journal in my field because of how many manuscripts I've reviewed. So that's given me a degree of expertise in sort of manuscript criticism and being able to sort of critique arguments logically and also see kind of a broader spectrum of arguments from the range of like very academically strong arguments to very academically weak arguments. So that's given me a good sense of like what is rigorous, what is academically, scrupulous, and what are arguments that are sort of weaker. So that's the sort of skill set that I try to bring to bear on theological questions in ways that I hope are sort of intellectually nourishing and enriching, but not always, sometimes it's theologically iconoclastic, and I hope that gives my community some interesting insights. And along the way, I've really fostered a community of people who are really quite skeptical and really very interesting to talk to. So I'm really proud of the community that I have. So I hope that people will check out my channel, and also please check out the specific video that I did that we'll probably link somewhere in the comments or the
Yeah,
description about
yeah,
Paulogia's minimal witnesses model. But yeah,
yeah. I'm gonna add a link to the description.
great.
Uh,
Okay, super. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, before we begin with your objections to the Paulogia's hypothesis, let me just give a very quick recap for in case someone in the audience doesn't know about it. What basically about Paulogia is saying is called a minimal witnesses hypothesis because he wants to keep the number of hallucinations or visions to a minimum. He wants to say that only Peter had an hallucination, basically, or a vision of Jesus, and he managed to convince the others by the other early disciples or early Christians by mm, a means of social contagion or something like that, right? That's what he said. And what is important there is he wants to say that the resting place of the Jesus body was unknown to the disciples. They didn't knew where the body was, so there was no tomb, empty tomb, or anything like that. That's the two most important things I will say. We later on we're going to go over each item one by one, and we're going to have a discussion on this. So yeah, Tabo, do you want to give you like an overview? What are your main objections to the topologia's hypothesis?
Yeah. So in the video itself that I did, there's seven different critique points, which maybe I'll just review those points just really, really briefly. But the seven critiques that I put in the video are, number one, that I think the tenet of the minimal witness is probably flawed. Most scholars would endorse the fact that there was a community of believers. Number two, I think the mechanism of Peter having post-bereavement hallucinations is flawed. Number three, there is sort of a heavy reliance when Paulogia has debates that Paul had some pre-existing guilt-induced psychosis. I think that's a flawed explanation. We can talk about why. Then I actually personally think there's actually pretty good evidence for the empty tomb. And the next tenet is that I think the mechanism of the Gospels being written later, theology changing over decades, stories being embellished later, contradicts what we know. All the fact that we have several pre-Pauline creeds that at least list the resurrection. I don't think it explains well the growth of Christianity, and I think there's a lot of other, we'll say, the other categories of arguments are sort of missing areas of context, where I think that there are facets of the early evolution of Christianity that we don't have a really good explanation for in minimal witnesses. That's the core of my argument. And again, Juan, feel free to time me so I don't go over, because I don't want to be too long.
Okay, that's fine.
Yeah, but the way I sort of revise those points for this conversation is the first point that I'm going to have is that Paulogia does have a kind of an unfortunate habit of misquoting, misreferencing, and using evidence incorrectly. And there's several, we can go through several things that Paulogia specifically says, where he has a conclusion about the evidence that I think is not supported by a very, very plain reading of the evidence itself. Point two that I want to talk, I hope we get into today, is there are many aspects where there's sort of a causal or mechanistic hand waving by Paulogia. In other words, he'll say that, the belief in Jesus started with Peter and then spread through social contagion. We don't really have any mechanism for why social contagion could have carried these beliefs to other people, and how that could have been convincing for other people. So there's not a lot of parallels that we have. Point number three is we lack a lot of historical precedent. So Paulogia has sort of a bit of a bad habit of just saying, this is what likely explains this. He doesn't explain how in history those mechanisms have come to pass in other scenarios. So there's sort of a lack of historical research precedent behind Paulogia's beliefs. Point four is there is a bit of a lack of consistency in the points of Paulogia. Briefly, I'll just say that, if you look at points 4, 5, and 6, they all rely on Peter being present and doing a lot of heavy lifting. So Peter has to get very, very involved in the spreading of the belief system very, very early on. And then, you get, so that's points 4 through 6, essentially. Point 4 is most of Jesus' disciples disappeared with the exception of Peter. Point 5 is Peter had a post-bereavement hallucination. Point 6, and Paulogia's minimal witnesses argument, is that James became part of Peter's movement. But then point 7 is that then Peter was totally out of the situation as the movement grew, and so he somehow gets totally yeeted out of the mechanism for how the stories about Jesus continue to spread in point 7 that Paulogia makes. So you can see there's a little bit of inconsistency. Now, I think the reason for this is that Paulogia cites a lot of different traditions. He cites sort of social contagion theory, myth theory, a lot of other, hallucination theory, obviously. So he's sort of bringing together a conglomeration of different theories about Jesus that have been advocated in the past. And because of that, he sort of has to skip from one tenet of each theory to the next to make his own theory kind of cohesive. All right, point 5 is we don't have a lot of good explanations for Paul's conversion. It's a lot of hand-waving. Paulogia talks about PTSD. He talks about guilt-induced psychosis. Now, this is not an entity that comes up in the DSM-5. It's also something that, again, we lack historical precedent for. We lack an understanding of. If you'll, for instance, we know there are about 20,000 Nazis who committed war crimes. We don't know of any of them who had conversion experiences. So we don't really have a historical analogy of Paul. As a matter of fact, I couldn't find in any other religious tradition a figure who went from being antagonistic towards the religion, who initially went from being a prosecutor to then becoming a martyr. I didn't find any correlates of that in history. Point 6 is, I think for some reason Paulogia does mitigate the persecution of Christians without really good historical evidence. Now, this has got a lot of attention in some of the literature recently, and I hope we get into that, but I have a bit of a timeline of the persecution of Christians and why I think that's at least persuasive for at least the early community of believers. Point 6 that I have for this debate, which we can get into that a little bit more, is that it does rely heavily on post-bereavement hallucinations, which is not a DSM-5 criteria. DSM-5 is the main manual of psychiatric illnesses. So again, we'll talk about these points in further detail. But I did go back to the main piece of evidence that Paulogia cites, which is from 2015. Now, persistent grief disorder was added to the DSM-5 as a separate category in 2022. And we've really gained a lot of insight into how we experience bereavement since that article was written. So I hope that we can get into that in this debate. Point 7 is Paulogia does rely heavily on an unmarked mass and secret grave, or the body of Jesus merely being discarded from history. I don't think there's very good evidence for that. We can go into all the evidence for why the body of Jesus was discarded. Point 8 is obviously, I'd be remiss if I didn't say the biggest apologetical argument against minimal witnesses has been that there's no explanation for group appearances. Point 9 is there is a conflation in the debate between what are minimal witnesses and what are minimal surviving testimonials. So there's a bit of a conflation in the debate. So just because we don't have more written attestations doesn't mean that we don't have more witnesses. And finally, point 10 is there are a lot of methods of academic scholarship that Paulogia kind of doesn't use as well as he could. So, for instance, we know a lot of information about the Jewish war, but all our information about the Jewish war is essentially from one witness, was Josephus. And we know a lot about the Spartacus revolt, but we only know about the Spartacus revolt from one witness, which is Plutarch. So just because we have one set of writings doesn't mean that we can't infer other truths about a historical event that happened. All right, so the last thing I do want to say is the Paulogia's got a really great channel. It's really fantastic. And I do want to say a few things that I just kind of extol the virtues of Paulogia. Number one, in full admission, even though I really enjoyed getting into these arguments, and I think that minimal witnesses is flawed for a number of reasons, I do think that if I were to debate Paulogia, he would absolutely annihilate me. He's a fantastic debater. He's a very insightful individual. I've had the chance to see him debate a couple of times. Really wonderful. The other thing that I want to say is I really do appreciate his videos. I think they're not just interesting, I think they're also educational. And number 3, I think maybe the most important thing that Paulogia has done is take a bunch of different arguments against Jesus, a bunch of different antagonistic arguments, and put them in the forefront of the lay public debate. Now, the reason why I think this is important is because, as I've said in a lot of my videos, I think that Christianity does have a problem with anti-intellectualism right now. I know that I have learned a lot more about Jesus because I've researched Paulogia's debate. And I think if Paulogia makes people learn more about Jesus, about the New Testament, about different writings around historicity, about historical scholarship, I think that's really fantastic. I think there is sort of a refrain in Christianity that, you shouldn't doubt anything that you hear, right? And that refrain gets sort of translated to audiences as you really shouldn't have any critical thinking skills about what you hear. And I think that's really unfortunate. I think if you can't ask questions, if you can't express your doubts, if you can't express what your questions are, you're never going to grow intellectually. So, I think if Christianity is true, if you're supposed to love God with all your heart, your soul, and all your mind, then I think Paulogia is ultimately going to help people in the long run have a more enlightened, more intellectually nourished, and more well-rounded perspective on the historicity of Jesus. All right, so that's hopefully that was brief enough and went through enough points, at least for an introduction. And I hope we get into some of these points in greater detail in our conversation.
Yeah, that was great. Thank you. Okay, so I think now we can just look at the hypothesis, and then we go one by one. Let's see. So, okay. Let's start from the first one. Okay, the first two I think are relatively uncontroversial. So, in the early first century, among the apocalyptic preachers active in Judea was one Jesus of Nazareth, right? So, I know you quibble a little bit with the notion of apocalyptic preacher. Last time. What do you think about this?
Yeah. All right. So, I think it's really important to note a few things. Number one, there are several aspects of Jesus' teachings that don't match with apocalyptic teachings. Okay, so now, as Bart Ehrman, E.P. Sanders, and many others have advocated, if you advance a theory about Jesus, and I'll try and keep this very, very brief because I don't want to get too lost down this rabbit hole, but it's incumbent on the person who advances a theory about Jesus, if that theory is based on the statements of Jesus, that they prove that Jesus actually made those statements. We have no evidence that Jesus said anything about apocalypticism other than the Gospels themselves, okay? So the question is, can we verify that because something shows up in the Gospels, that that's an actual teaching of Jesus? Now, there are several problems why we would doubt the apocalyptical sayings of Jesus. Number one, every saying where Jesus says that there's a time frame is contradicted almost immediately by a separate saying very later, very shortly on after Jesus says, yeah, here's the apocalyptic time frame, that no one can know the hour or the time. Now, it's also well known among scholars that if there are two statements of Jesus and they contradict each other, that means that we should take each of them with lower degree of veracity. Also, people have sort of estimated what percentage of statements that are in the Gospels, even including statements in all four Gospels, were actually uttered by Jesus. And we don't actually have a good understanding that it's any better than 50%. So if you have two conflicting statements, I don't know that you can say this group of statements is clearly the right one, and this one is the wrong one. Now, the other important aspects to look at is the Gospels are all based on people trying to create a narrative that is theologically compelling to other people in their community around Judea. And we do know with absolute certainty that people like, probably John the Baptist, Theudas, Jews of Galilee, the Egyptian prophet, those were all apocalyptical prophets, many of whom had audiences who overlapped with Jesus, right? So it's highly likely that the gospel writers would have tried to develop harmonies between what Jesus was saying and what those other individuals were saying to try and expand their audience. We know that there was sort of a strategy of trying to expand the audience of Jesus. So in other words, I think it's very likely that somebody would have tried to falsely harmonize the beliefs of Jesus by conflating them with other apocalyptical teachings that were circulating prominently in the region. Now, there are several other reasons why I'm skeptical about the apocalyptic teachings specifically. One important one is we do have several people who have written about what the features are that give rise to apocalyptical teachings and the palatability of those teachings within a populace. Those understandings rely on what are the sociological factors that are occurring in that population and at that time. So we know that all those factors were very, very prominent and very poignantly felt in Judea in the first century. So again, it's highly likely that there were high apocalyptical aspirations. So we also have to see Jesus through the lens of what Jesus was at. We have to endeavor to see Jesus through the lens of what Jesus was actually saying, not what the audience was hearing. Okay. And then my final point that I want to make is if you take that sentence of Jesus where he says, not a generation shall pass, and you move that sentence just a few sentences up, you actually have a very, very different meaning and a very different context. So not only do you have to accept that Jesus said that sentence to accept the thesis that Jesus was an apocalyptical teacher, you also have to believe that he said those sentences in that specific order. Now, to me, that's a harder sell, and for that reason, I'm at least more skeptical about Jesus being an apocalyptical prophet than a lot of people are.
Okay, I see. Yeah, that's interesting. I never heard that before. I just have one small comment where you say that there is a contradiction or a discrepancy between Jesus saying, okay, this generation won't pass. It will be like in one generation before the end comes. And then he also says, well, nobody knows the exact time, right? You see this as kind of contradictory, but I don't necessarily see it this way, because I could say, okay, I could tell you it will be more or less one generation before this happens, which is a large time frame. But if you ask me the exact day, I will say, no, I don't know with the exact day. Nobody knows, but it's kind of a generation. I think those two things don't contradict really. They match. That's the way I would see it, right?
Well, okay, so yeah, and here's why that's how scholars who argue for this thesis have harmonized those contradictions, right? So that's been the main retort is, well, we can sort of harmonize. I think to me, a plain reading suggests that these are just sort of different and contradictory statements if you just read the statements plainly on their own. But the other problem is, let's say a generation is about 40 years, and Jesus is saying no one can know the hour, no one can know the time. Well, as you get closer to I could say that, okay, maybe it's going to happen next year, maybe it's going to happen 2 years, maybe it's going to happen 3 years. The problem is, though, once you get to 39, 38 years, now you're starting to narrow down the time, right? So that only works until the end of the time frame. So it's kind of like the same problem of the unexpected hanging paradox, right? Where you say, oh, maybe I shouldn't go into that because it's too much of a rabbit hole. But that is the main harmonization. I think that's less palatable to me for a lot of other reasons. But again, I don't want to go down too far this because this is
Yeah,
not something that Paulogia spends most of his time talking about when he talks about the minimal witnesses argument.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so let's take a look at the second thing. Uh, yeah, Jesus said or did controversial things which led to his crucifixion on a cross, a common practice at the time. I mean, is this like, you got anything to say here? Or
I don't think crucifixion was super common, but yeah, I don't. I'll grant that fact. Yeah.
okay. So now we get to the interesting part. I think this is probably one of the most controversial key parts. Okay, the resting place of Jesus' body was unknown to his followers, right? So what Paulogia wants to say here is that the body Jesus' body got buried in a some kind of obscure, and he even says secretive manner, right? And
Yeah. Yeah.
many people have an issue with that. So I will let you go first. What are your issues with this hypothesis? I'm gonna say what he's appealing to, what he's appealing to here, what Paulogia says, is that this is the normal thing that will happen. That a body crucified by as a criminal, it will normally get buried in some weird unmarked grave in an obscure way, right? Not in a tomb in the way that the gospel describes it. So what Paulogia is saying, that we can't believe that because this is what normally will happen, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. What are your feelings about this? Let me ask you what before you get into this. Have you looked into the sources that Paulogia cites when he talks about this?
Yeah.
What are your feelings? I know you've had a lot of people on your channel about this.
Yeah, actually, yes, I do. I kind of have mixed feelings about it. I'm not sure. I'm inclined to agree with Paulogia here, actually, because there are two ways. There were two ways that skeptics deal with this issue. But basically, they need a body that cannot be checked, because they're going to say later, okay, Peter had hallucinations, right? But if the body can't be checked, then this doesn't work, right? They will just go check the body. So
Yeah.
there are two ways they can do it. One way is the way Paulogia does it. He's going to say maybe Jesus got buried somewhere and they didn't know exactly where. Another way is they actually grant the empty tomb. And people like James Foro, they say, yeah, maybe somebody took Jesus' body because they wanted to rebury it, or they stole it, or they could say they stole it. That's another way they can do it. What I actually am inclined to agree with the first way, because I feel like if I do the second way, it's like I'm postulating something like even more unlikely. Like I'm adding an unlikely situation on top of an already unlikely situation, right? Which is the whole visions and hallucinations thing. So it feels really ad hoc and unlikely at the end. So I actually prefer to go to the first route. I actually agree with him, and I have checked. I have some sources here I could show you about why this was the normal thing, a burial in a criminal graveyard. Do you have anything to say here?
Yeah. All right. So I think the main thing here is that, again, if we were using academic standards, we would have to quote the literature very precisely. And I think this is where Paulogia does fall short. Although, again, I can't say enough kind things about Paulogia and how great his channel is. I think he does fall short here for a lot of reasons. Now, let's look at the sources that he quotes. So the first source he quotes, and he said, the body of Jesus, this is in his No Resurrection Required video. So it's not in his article. But the first point that he makes in the video is the body should be discarded or left for animals, and he cites Quintilian Declamations 274. Well, let's read Quintilian Declamations 274. Whenever we crucify the guilty, the most crowded roads are chosen, where most people can see and be moved by fear, for penalties relate not so much to retribution as to their exemplary effect. Okay, now this doesn't necessarily indicate that that it's not humiliation that was the goal here, but public visibility. It also doesn't make the point that I think Paulogia says that it makes, which is that the body should be discarded. This does not show up in Quintilian Declamations 274, at least when he says it in the video. All right, source number 2 that he cites is Scott 48.21.1, which is the civil law. Now that's in his video, 48.21.1. Now this was very frustrating to me because if you read it, that has nothing to do with anything that he's talking about in the video, right? So I'll read it. It was in capital crimes, it has been decreed by the emperors that the corruption of an adversary shall not prejudice the party guilty of it, and this rule applies to such cases only as involved the penalty of death, for they decided that a person who desires to save his life in any way, whatever, should be pardoned. This has nothing to do with, so that was very frustrating to me. So I think what he's referring to is Ulpian's Digesta 48.24.1. And that's what he cites in the article that he has on Bart Ehrman's blog, but it's not what he cites in the video. So I don't know why he never corrects that in his video, but it took a lot of frustration to figure out why he was citing this law for me. I did a really deep dive into 48.21.1 to figure out what Paulogia's meaning was before I realized he's probably citing Digesta 48.24.1. But I don't know why he never corrected that. I don't know why no one in his audience ever corrected that. I've seen several hours of video, and I don't think this must be a very gross mistake. It must be a very gross error. Now, I'm happy to also talk about the full quote of 48.24.1 because that is what Paulogia cites in the blog post and not in the video. All right, so here's the full quote, which is 48.24.1. The bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused to their relatives. And the divine Augustus, in the 10th book of his life, said that this rule had been observed. Okay, this is Ulpian writing. At present, the bodies of those who have been punished are only buried when this has been requested and permission granted. And sometimes it is not permitted, especially when persons have been convicted of high treason. Even the bodies of those who have been sentenced to be burned can be claimed, blah, blah, blah. The rest of the quote isn't relevant. All right. But so here what Ulpian is writing is that the bodies of those who are condemned should not be refused to their relatives. And this was tradition during the reign of divine Augustus. Now, there is a different time frame, so we have to look at what the time frame that Ulpian is referring to when he says at present. So at present refers to a specific time frame, which is the time frame in which Ulpian is writing, and that's around the year 200 to 223 CE. So again, this is not relevant to the year 30 CE. In the year 30 CE, we'll have to, if we look at this quote and think that it applies to Roman law, we have to say this was the time in which the rule of Augustus had been observed. So now Augustus actually himself reigned from I think 27 BCE to 14 CE. Okay, so now this was in 30 CE, but this was within the reign of Emperor Tiberius. He reigned from 14 CE to 37 CE, and he was the successor of Augustus, right? So keep in mind, Paulogia is using this statement as his evidence. So if we read this statement using a very, very plain reading, it says the bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused to their relatives. And this was under the understanding during the reign of Augustus. And because this precedent was very important and was not overturned until the at present moment that Ulpian describes, we would not expect for any different rule to be utilized. So in other words, during Tiberius, the precedent set forth by Augustus would have been respected. And this law that Paulogia is citing states very clearly the bodies of those who are condemned to death should not be refused to their relatives. It's only later on, at present, in this quote, where Ulpian is saying now the laws were changed. So I don't know if this is certainly to a degree at least very sloppy citation, right? Because initially he has the wrong citation up. But at the very least, I think if you read this quotation in a very plain way, I can't see how anyone would read this quotation and think that it supports Paulogia's case. The next citation that's important to look at, and I'll be brief on these other points, is Josephus 4.202 in the Antiquities of the Jews. Now, I'll read this also. He that blasphemeth God, let him be stoned, and let him hang upon a tree all day, and let him be buried in an ignominious manner. Right?
Yeah,
now, Paulogia says this means secret. Okay, but Josephus is clearly saying it's not secret, it's ignominious. Now the question is, if Jesus had been buried, would we have had any marker if he's buried in a way that's ignominious? Now, we know it's not a mass grave. Okay, the Jewish Mishnah Sanhedrin 5.6 says very specifically that you have to have specific graves for different individuals. This was a very, and they have to be deep graves, right? So you can't just have a shallow grave. You can't just have a pit grave. You can't have a potter's field. All right, and we know from the book of Joshua 7:25-26, and we know the second book of Samuel, 2 Samuel 18:17, that when you are buried as a criminal and there's no public mourning, which is that's the main rule of an ignominious grave, is you can't publicly mourn, you can't venerate that grave. So we know that if those laws applied, that there would have been a pile of stones placed on the grave so that there would still be a marker for where Jesus was buried, right? So it's not a secret grave. It's not a discarded body. It's not a common pit grave according to Jewish law. This is a very plain reading of Jewish law. Says you can't have any of these features, and you would at least still have to have some marker. You can't venerate the grave. You can't do any public mourning. You're not supposed to visit the grave with flowers and such. But there would have been at least a large heap of stones to mark where the body of Jesus was buried. Now, it's really, really important to note another thing that often gets overlooked in this whole debate, and I'll try to be brief on this point. But Jesus was buried during a very specific time in Jewish burial practices during the first century. In fact, the year 30 was probably at or very near the peak of this very, very brief tradition where instead of people being buried in graves, they were placed in rock-hewn tombs. Then they were left in this tomb for a year, okay? And then they were taken out of the tomb and their bones were put in an ossuary box. So this practice of rock-hewn tomb burial followed by ossuary boxes was very unique to the time of Jesus. And if we believe in that, then we still have a place where Jesus would have been, which is what he would have been in a rock-hewn tomb. And we still definitely have, a way of harmonizing all of the information, including the information that Paulogia puts out. But the point is, there's nothing in Jewish law that says that the criminal's grave has to be secret, that it has to be hidden from others, and there's absolutely, it would have been a very, very big sin for the Jews to have a body just kind of discarded or thrown in a common grave. And it's not a sin against Jesus. We're not saying that people respected Jesus so much they wouldn't want to do that. It's a sin against the land. So it defiles the land if you have bodies that are buried, if they're buried late, if they're buried after sunset, that's a crime against the land. It makes the land impure. Purity was very important for Second Temple Judaism. And if you have people just tossed in a big unmarked grave or a pit grave or a common grave, then you have the same problem. So I don't think this is addressed ever by Paulogia, and I really don't think that he's using any analysis that is applicable to the year 30 CE. And the quotations that he's using are certainly, like, if anything, they support the other direction. So I know that was a long-winded rant, but I really don't see any convincing case for a discarded body or a secret body at all.
Yeah. No, I agree that maybe that the word secret is going a bit too far, right? It's like, okay,
Yeah,
they're going to keep this in secret. No, I don't think that's like, okay, we have to make this a secret, like nobody can know. No, I don't think that's what would have happened, right? A better word is probably just unknown or obscure, So here is the thing. You say, for example, that Jesus could have been buried in a grave, but there would have been a pile of stones to mark the grave. I do have some quotes on this I want to show, but here's the thing. It wouldn't have been an inscription with the name Jesus. So that pile of stones would have been undistinguishable from any other pile of stones around in the other graves. So that's what I'm getting at. It wouldn't have been possible to go to the site weeks later and check, oh, look, this is Jesus' grave. So that's what he's trying to say. Like, it wouldn't have been that easy because this pile of stones would have been the same as any other pile of stones. And you say Jesus could have been buried in a rock cut tomb, right? From what I've heard, this is a very expensive thing to make. This is not for everybody, really, let alone much less for criminals, right? Some people would have been in this kind of tomb, but I don't think the poor ones will have been able to afford these ones. And I do have some interesting quotes here I want to show. So about the burial. So burial in a criminal graveyard would have been the normal thing, right? Mr. Sanhedrin says that there is 2 graveyards, one for criminals and this and that. So I will try to be brief as well. We also have Talmud sadly talking about a dishonorable burial, just as a wicked person. Weak person is not to be buried beside a righteous one. So he's a grossly weak person not to be buried besides a morally weak, right? So there are different graveyards for the really mean person and one for the normal bad people. And Josephus says, yeah, you just showed me that we talked about this quote already, right? He who blasphemed God, let him be stored and be buried in an ignominious and obscure manner, right?
Mm-hmm.
And here is something in the Komarinsky's book about the resurrection. is that graves would have been unmarked, right? Few graves were marked by headstones and more marked with just a pile of loose rocks, like you said. And in fact, there is another person who says that some graves may have not been marked at all. They will just throw mix some chalk with water and pour it over the grave. That's what some other scholars say. So yeah, so that's what I will say here. That's what would have normally happen to Jesus' body. And another argument one could make here is the lack of veneration of the empty tomb. Like, how come we don't see any veneration of the empty tomb? Is this if this was a known place? One would think that the place where Jesus resurrected will be the most venerated place. But this argument loses a lot of force because of the fact that oh, of the fact that Jerusalem was destroyed right in the 70s, and everything and things got built over the ruins and all of that. So I don't think this is a super strong argument, but you can add to that. So what I will say at the end is simply to say that maybe Jesus, as a criminal, got buried in some kind of criminal's graveyard, and the followers were not around. They were afraid. The moment the authorities got to them, they went everywhere, right? They weren't present at the moment they got buried. The authorities did this, so they didn't know exactly which grave Jesus was. And later on, it would have been a mass criminal graveyard with some rocks, but nobody knew which rocks was Jesus' tomb, right? So, I mean, the guy who buried them would have known, but the followers of Jesus wouldn't have known at that moment. So they weren't in a position where they could check. Okay, oh, here is his body. The body is still there. No, so that's what I would say simply about that, right? So what would you say about this?
Okay, all right. This is where the Jewish literature around Jesus becomes very important. Now, I think it's Sanhedrin 43a that says this. Yeah, it's Sanhedrin 43a. So this actually shows up in a few different places. So one of the most common arguments that gets argued against this is Jesus would not have been able to afford a rock-hewn tomb. Now, then we have the, Joseph of Arimathea who comes in, and then, there's a lot of doubt over whether or not he actually existed. And this seems like a very convenient explanation from a Christian standpoint. So I can understand the skepticism about this point. Here's why I think it's compelling, okay? If you look at the rock-hewn tomb, this is not Joseph of Arimathea saying like, yeah, you're gonna be, we're giving this up, this tomb up forever. He's just giving it up to Jesus for essentially a period of 1 year, right? Mm-hmm. So as long as no one in his family dies over that year, and plus each rock-hewn tomb had several little compartments for bodies to be put in. So that's why that story sort of makes sense to me. Now we also have several writings from the Jews that say that Jesus was unique, and his dealing with his punishment was very difficult and challenging because he had so many friends in high places. So now this could refer to Roman government, or it could refer to Joseph of Arimathea, but this suggests that it was well known to the Jews that Jesus did have allies who were wealthier, who were more privileged, who were more influential. So we have this in Sanhedrin 43a, which has a proclamation of Jesus needing to be stoned because he led Israel astray, and people have to proclaim this, but they found nothing in his favor, so he was hanged on the eve of Passover. Okay, this is according to the Jewish Talmud, so this is a canonical writing. So later on, if you keep reading, that actually has a discussion where people say, well, why did we have to send people out to make this proclamation? The reason that's given in this passage is because Jesus had so many friends in such high places. This to me lends credence to the fact that somebody wealthy could have donated their rock-hewn tomb to Jesus. We also have, the Rashi, who writes in the 11th century that Jesus had close connections with the government and people in power, so the Jews were afraid of the supporters of Jesus. We also have writings by Rabbi Menahem HaMeiri in the 13th century, sorry, I'm probably mispronouncing that, who said that Jesus had many supporters who were men of influence. That's a direct quote. So I think the Jewish writings are quite harmonious with the narrative that the Christians are giving. Now, it's also important to know what Jewish tradition was. So if you read Antiquities 4.202, it again, I think the best term is ignominious burial, but there's no tradition that suggests that the burial would have been unlocalizable, right? So it doesn't suggest that the body would have been lost. It just says there's no funeral rites, there's no public grief, and there's no honored tomb. But we do know that burials would have been traceable, right? There was a designated burial ground, there were known locations, there were segregated areas for those who are executed, and we know that archaeologically this is confirmed, right? So with like Yehohanan ben Hagkol, who was the body who was found in 1968, suggests, finding his body suggests there's no tomb, there's no venerated tomb, but we don't totally lose the burial information. So burial was mandatory. Burial for criminals were in known categories of tombs, and the text prohibits mourning, but it doesn't mean that those bodies wouldn't have been identified. It doesn't mean the body would have been erased. Jewish purity laws required actually knowing where graves were. So I think you could argue that maybe there was if he was buried in the ground, which I still think it's more likely that he was in a rock-hewn tomb, both because of temporally when he died and when his body was disposed of, and because that harmonizes the New Testament evidence with several canonical Jewish statements. But even if you put him in the ground, I think it's still a very big stretch to say that his body was then, lost. So I could see what you're saying, that what if there were a bunch of graves that had a bunch of stones on them, then they wouldn't have known which one was Jesus. But I think you're number one, presupposing a circumvention of a lot of Jewish laws that says that every grave has to be known, that you have to have at least some information about grave, and then you're also sort of presupposing there would have been enough people in that category that there would have been just a big field with multiple stones. I think it's hard to imagine, and it would have been a violation of Jewish practice, and it sort of circumvents all the knowledge that we have about Jews, that graves would be lost, and all the laws that work against the common grave are also applicable against like sort of this potter's field idea. So moreover, I think the resurrection proclamation was early on enough that this, in other words, I have a whole video on the empty tomb, but I just think it's unlikely that they would have said, well, it's years later, now we can't find where the body went. Now, you also have to keep in mind that all of the Jewish polemical responses to the resurrection, and there are many, we have dozens of different versions of different recensions, and we have the Toledo Yeshu, and we have a lot of different writings about Jesus. They all start with the problem of the empty tomb, right? So we have the empty tomb in all of Christian literature, right? We also have the empty tomb, and the empty tomb, I think, is pretty clearly attested to in Paul. And we have the empty tomb in all of the Jewish polemical responses. So if the body was indeed lost, I would expect that at least somewhere in the Jewish literature, they would have said, no, the body didn't rise from the dead. It was merely lost. I would expect to see at least one of the responses to say that. None of the Jewish responses say, look, we just lost the body. We discarded it. It was in a common grave. We just don't know what happened. Instead, what we have when we look at the Jewish literature is lots of different explanations. The disciple stole the body. The gardener stole the body. This person stole the body. There's a Weekend at Bernie's scenario where they steal the body and they put it up in public, right? And then they kind of prop up Jesus and they walk him around, and then people see the body and they're like, oh, he's risen from the dead, right? And they didn't, it was just the body. So it's sort of a Weekend at Bernie's scenario. So the point is that why would none of those counter arguments that surface very early on just say the body was simply discarded? We don't really have a convincing narrative that the body of Jesus is merely discarded, I think, until about the mid-90s, and I'm talking about the mid-1990s. And we don't really have any arguments that sort of point to a discarded body until at the very earliest, the 18th century. So I'm willing to give more credence to all of the early arguments that happened for millennia before we get to really a very modern perspective on this. Personally, I think if I had any claim in history with as much evidence as the empty tomb, it would be a hands-down case. The only reason it's rejected by historical scholars is because it sort of points towards a theology that supports Jesus. But I think if it were just an empty historical claim, I was like, look at all this evidence, every historian would agree if it was a banal claim. And the empty tomb is not in and of itself miraculous. So I don't know that we need a higher standard for evidence than we need for any other historical claim. All right, hopefully that wasn't too long-winded. It's really interesting stuff to get into this, but there are some real problems with what Paulogia is citing and how he's citing them, and the fact that he's not giving the quotations, and the fact that he's not explaining how those quotations support his argument.
Okay, yeah, that was great. So just a few things quickly. Well, you say, okay, why the point you make about other historical documents, why do we treat this one different? Is because, well, okay, it's not, if we're just saying that if we saw a narration of an empty tomb in a mundane context, then the normal thing to do would be to take it at face value, right? To say, sure, that happens. I mean, yeah, of course, because because it's a mundane claim, right? It's not in the context of an extraordinary claim. It's not in a document that speaks about, miraculous things, or people walking on water, or turning water into wine and stuff
Yeah,
like that, right?
I'm just saying there's an empty tomb. I'm not saying you have to believe in the resurrection. I'm just
Yeah,
saying
yeah, sure.
there was a tomb, the body was missing somehow.
Yeah, yeah, but you cannot. But what you say is like, if a lot of invention and embellishment already got into the document, then there is a higher chance that some of the also stuff that appears mundane, right, but a part of the concept that could also be an invention, right? If we are already saying that, you know what I mean? So yeah,
I guess I see what you're saying. That you can maybe you're saying let's move this into the category of a theological claim because there's so many other theological arguments around
yeah,
it. But here's the problem: you're relying on that being a later embellishment. I don't think there's convincing evidence for that. Paul talks about a burial of Jesus, so he talks about the word he uses is actually for interment, right? Which suggests at least some sort of funerary process, right? So the fact that Paul says there was a burial and then Jesus rose. I mean, there's a lot of writings that I've encountered say Paul doesn't say anything about the empty tomb, right? But to me, that's pretty clear, right? If you walk up to me and you say, "Hey, there was this tomb, and this person was buried, and then he rose," I would sort of assume that you like. In other words, I don't think Paul needs to say, "And when he rose, that tomb that he had been in was left behind, and it was empty." Like, I think, is there a need for Paul to say that for any rhetorical perspective? I don't think he does. I mean, I think the narrative is buried and then he rose, right? But Paul emphasizes that he was buried. So to me, there's a tomb. This creates the problem of the empty tomb. I mean, I just don't. I don't see a convincing case to be made against the interview unless you say, yes, this is absolutely a miraculous disappearance of the body. If you say that the empty tomb is the equivalent of a miraculous disappearance of the body, then I guess I could say, well, you have to have a higher standard. But, you're also sort of embracing a separate argument, which is a separate conversation, which is, do extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence? Now, we can get into that. That's a more broad philosophical claim, but I think it's flawed to make that statement for a lot of reasons, which I've gone into in a recent comment discussion. So I'm happy to, I don't want to chase too many rabbit holes, and I'm happy to move on to the next topic. But to me, empty tomb does not require a miracle. It just requires an empty tomb. There's nothing theological about that. So, and for any other claim, this is an overwhelming amount of evidence. And even if it is maybe a slightly theological claim, I think there's still a lot of overwhelming evidence for it. Is there extraordinary evidence? Well, I think that's a very subjective term. For some people, this would be an extraordinary amount of evidence. For some people, it wouldn't. But I don't personally believe extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Let me just give you one brief anecdote. Somebody showed me a CT scan recently. It was widely metastatic renal cancer that the patient had, and it spontaneously disappeared without any treatment, right? And I was like, that's extraordinary. Did we do anything else to do? Do you say, no, we have to do another CT scan to prove this? No, we looked at it and we said, well, your tumor is completely resolved. That patient got later screening studies, that patient got later, but we weren't like, oh, we have to do an MRI, we have to do a scintigraphic study, we have to do additional imaging. We said it's an extraordinary claim, but the routine evidence is perfectly adequate to explain it. So anyways, I don't really think there's convincing evidence to be made that. I'm happy to debate anyone on the empty tomb. I think there's pretty solid evidence for it. But anyway, we can go on to the next minimal fact.
yeah. Agree. We can move on to the next item. So
Great points.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's great points. So this Jesus had some followers while he was alive, but mostly disappeared into lives never recorded by reliable history, never to be heard from again, all except Simon, Peter, and possibly John. Right? Any issue here?
I mean, there's a huge survivorship bias here. We don't know what happened to the rest of the disciples by name, so we can't, trace people from named person to named person. We know that we have the writings of Papias, and who's the other guy? Oh, I'm blanking on his name, but they talk about Aristion, who was another disciple of Jesus, right? So Papias and
Polycarp.
Polycarp, yeah, thank you, yeah. Papias and Polycarp cite John and Aristion, so we know that there were other disciples. They also cite the other elders, and the elders are thought to be also other disciples of Jesus, although those elders are not named. So we know that there was a community. So again, it's sort of like saying, well, because we only have the names of these people, we know that there were no other believers. I think that's sort of a leap in logic that Paulogia is making here. So now I will say that we do have, again, Mishnah Sanhedrin 43a, which names 5 other disciples of Jesus who were also killed after Jesus. Now, I don't think any of those names are reliable. I don't think they're reliably recorded. They're not concordant with any of the Christian literature, but I think this at the very least says that there were some other followers of Jesus. Some of those other followers, at least, were killed early on. So I agree we don't have people who are named at the historical record. I don't personally find that very compelling. There are not a lot of people who are named in first century Judea, even if they're peripheral to a very interesting situation that we have records of, that we can trace from named person, personal narrative to named personal narrative subsequently in history. So in other words, we can't trace people by name, but we know that there were other people involved.
Yeah. Okay, sure, we can look at, but let me just say something quickly about it. Don't you find it maybe just a little bit weird, for example, that nobody will mention what happened to Philip? For example, Philip, allegedly, he was a first-hand disciple of Jesus. He was, even some people will say, he was doing miracles, that the disciples kept doing miracles and signs in their names. But not, the thing is, nobody later appears, and we have a document saying, "Oh, here I was with Philip, right? I talked to him. He was preaching this and that." Like, nobody records this at all, and this happens for all 10 or 9, I think. Maybe John. Maybe we have people saying they got stuff from John. So Paulogia makes that caveat. But other than Peter and John, we have nothing, right? We hear nothing at all. And supposedly they were very active preaching, and you know what I'm getting at, right?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's an astute observation. I just think we have to look through the lens of first century Judea and mid first century Judea specifically, and not through the lens of even late first century Judea. Now, we do, just to mention Philip briefly, we do know about Philip the evangelist, right, who was in the book of Acts, who had the daughters of Philip, right? We have the daughters of Philip showing up in the writings of Polycarp and Papias again, right? So they actually trace the daughters of Philip. There are 4 different daughters that Philip the evangelist had. And this is, and they actually do supply Polycarp and Papias with information, which is, to me, very interesting and fascinating. It's also relevant to point out that you're talking about other people performing miracles, and there's interesting literature about that. I won't get into it because it's too much of a rabbit hole. I don't find it convincing, but I recently read the Apocryphal Acts of John. Really fascinating stuff. It's very interesting. I don't think that proves that John did any miracles, but it's a very interesting apocryphal account. Now, the other thing that I'll just say is there's a lot of this stuff like, well, there was nothing written about this person, there was nothing written about that person. But what we have to keep in mind that writing was not common in the year 30 CE. Now, we know that there was a major uptick in writing in the year 40 CE. And we know that by the end of the century, there was a massive uptick in literature in Judea. Now, we know throughout the Roman Empire that writing actually rapidly increased at the last half and at the end of the first century for a lot of different reasons. We have, the ruins of Pompeii actually show that there was graffiti in Pompeii. Most of that graffiti happened after the year 40, right? So when people started writing actual words in graffiti, that all happened after the year 40. That's really an interesting time point that gets preserved in the ruins of Pompeii. We actually have the I forget what it's called, but the Inscriptionarium Latinarium, which is a body of about 200,000 different inscriptions in Latin. And we know, because we have that body, that we can trace there was a major uptick in writing at the end of the first century. So to me, it's not as though people were like, oh, we should write this down so people don't forget it. It's like the thought of writing something down wouldn't have occurred to somebody in 30 CE. probably not in 40 CE, but by the end of the century, we start to know a lot about Papias. We know a lot about Polycarp. We know a lot about Irenaeus. We know about John. We know about Aristion. So people are starting to write things down at the end of the century. It's just in the year 30 CE that and they write down things about the elders. So, but I think this idea that we should have a written what happened to Nathaniel. That's very unsatisfying to me as a modern audience member that we can't trace this, but we know that at least some of those disciples were killed. I think that's a pretty reasonable conclusion. And we know that the practice of writing about individuals was not something that was super common. Even Paul, a lot of the stuff that Paul writes is about his own theological belief systems. It's not about like, here's a bunch of documents about what happened to each person. That would have occurred to me if I were Paul. If I were Paul, I would have written a whole bunch of stuff about what happened to each of these people. But it's not surprising to me that we don't have those writings personally.
Yeah, that's a fair point. Okay, so let's keep going. Okay, this is probably the key one, the most important thing. Distraught after the death of his mentor, Simon Peter became sincerely, albeit mistakenly, convinced that Jesus had appeared to him. Right. So he's saying that Peter had some kind of bereavement hallucination after Jesus died, right? And this is what led to the belief in the resurrection, basically. So yeah, what are your main? This is a central point in the skeptics' naturalistic explanations for the resurrection. So what do you think of this?
Yeah, this is very clearly against the scientific literature. And this is again where Paulogia doesn't cite things correctly and appropriately. I think Paulogia is really great, so I can't say enough nice things about him, and he would absolutely annihilate me in a debate. But let's look what he actually says in his video, in his first video, No Resurrection Required. He says, quote, 30% of people who are bereaved will see, hear, and talk to the decedent, right? The person who passed away. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's something that Paulogia says. That figure in the literature is preposterous, okay? Nobody would argue that 30% of people who are bereaved will see, hear, and talk to, the loved one who passed on. Now, this figure of 30% to 60% gets thrown out a lot, okay, for post-bereavement hallucinations. It is not accurate, okay? The reason why it's not accurate is because if you read the source that Paulogia cites, Casanova et al., which is an article from 2015 about post-bereavement hallucination, first of all, our understanding of this entity really changed a lot starting in 2022, okay? So, and I could talk more about why that is. But if you read what they're citing, number one, they're all citing specifically literature that involves spousal bereavement. Okay, so now there is a point in their manuscript which says about 30% of people will either see or hear or talk to their loved one who's passed on. Now but that's an or, that's not an and. So again, Paulogia is really, really, I think, purposefully or unpurposefully, maybe just said something that was a little bit sloppy. But by saying and, you're really saying something that's totally counter to what the literature says. Now, if you look at the early literature from the 70s about post-bereavement hallucination, which is what Casanova et al. Are citing, it includes not only a true actual hallucination about the loved one, but it includes just sort of a strong sense that the loved one is still present, right? So that's not what we would generally think of as a hallucination. And that's why this literature has really been refined a lot since the year 2015. So in the year 2022, we actually include persistent grief disorder to underscore that there is this psychiatric entity and is now in the DSM-5. That's in 2022. Now, between 2015 and 2022, are the writings on this evolved, and we talked about complicated grief with internalized versus externalized manifestations. But all right, so just to summarize the important points. Number one, almost all of the literature that Paulogia could possibly be citing is in the case of spousal bereavement, right? Number two, there is even Casanova et al. I could pull up the paper. I've got it on my computer now. They even clearly admit that bereavement after friendship deaths, after the deaths of friends or teachers or other loved ones, nobody knows how often that is. Okay, they even cite that and they say it's not well studied. I could not find a single case report anywhere in the medical literature about somebody who had a loss, who had a bereavement, who subsequently then believed that that person reappeared to them. Okay, I could not find a single case report anywhere where a belief in bereavement turned into an actual delusion that that loved one had returned. Okay, the other thing that's important to note is a lot of things that are classified in the older literature as post-bereavement hallucinations are not hallucinations, right? They're just intense memories. For instance, if I say, I talked to my loved one, my wife who passed away, you wouldn't say that's a hallucination. You would say, well, you're talking to somebody because, for what, I mean, if you've got somebody in your life every day and you wake up with them, you've lived with them for many years and they pass on, you're still going to walk around the house and be like, Martha, I wish you were here right now. I'm having that coffee that I know you like, and you always nag me about it. You're going to say those things. That to me doesn't count as a hallucination. It's also really, really important to note that a lot of these hallucinations are hypnagogic or hypnopompic, right? Because they revolve around sleep. So we're talking about, you go to sleep with somebody every day for your whole life, and then you turn around and you see them, right? And you're like, and they passed on. Well, that's because you are going to sleep or you just woke up. So that's sort of a different category of hallucinatory experiences. And the last and the very most important thing that I want to say is, here's another really, really important point. Would Peter have had a brief sensory experience about Jesus and said, yes, Jesus rose from the dead, right? I think that's a massive, massive leap. We know that there's a Shabbat 102b, and there's other things that Peter says where, and other things that are written elsewhere. We know about the witch of Endor. So we know that there was a Jewish tradition of ghosts or spirits, and we know that sometimes people would transiently observe these ghosts or spirits. So if Peter just had a very transient experience, he would not have registered that as, yes, Jesus rose from the dead. I think, and then hopefully we'll get into this later, but then we have the whole problem of Peter being able to convince other people that what he saw was real. That's not really addressed by Paulogia, I think, in any convincing way at all, other than very brief hand waving about social contagion. I think that's a later fact, so I don't want to go too much into that.
That next point. That's next point.
I'll defer back to you then.
Yeah. Okay. So a few things fixed. I do think that the 30% figure is a little bit too high. I mean, it's too high.
Massively too
way
high.
Too high. Yeah.
Way too high.
I know that Dale Allison gives a figure about 8% actually in his resurrection book, which is a very, very famous book about the resurrection. It's probably the best one. So I don't know how much.
I'm happy to weigh in on that 8% figure, right? So we know that if you look at complicated bereavement versus regular bereavement, that figure is about 10%. So I don't know if that's where Dale Allison is getting that figure from, but complicated bereavement itself doesn't necessarily mean bereavement plus hallucinations. It means bereavement plus, in other words, complicated bereavement is marked by a bunch of other things like social withdrawal, like problems with your daily life, constant thinking about the person who passed away. It has to have a duration of, I think it's 12 months in adults and 6 months in pediatric patients. So now I want to address Dale Allison's argument because I see this a lot in the literature, and it's a major, major problem in biblical scholarship, and it shows up all the time, which is that Allison uses, and great researcher, fantastic. I love his writing. I love his conclusions. I think Dale Allison's really great. I think he gets a little bit of flack from the Christian community, which is unfortunate because he identifies as Christian, right? And the Christian community says, well, I think that's very unfortunate. But what he does, which is profoundly non-scientific and non-academic, is he says, I had my own experience with post-bereavement hallucinations, and therefore I can verify that this is actually something that happens. Now, this is not something you encounter anywhere else in the scientific literature, and it happens so often in biblical scholarship that I feel like I got to comment on it. Like you have, for instance, hallucinations producing new theological beliefs. We know from the medical literature and from the scholarly literature and the academic literature around mental health disorders, that should not happen, right? But you have Richard Carrier talking about, on your channel, has even said that, I've heard him say this several times, well, I had a hallucination and it resulted in a new theological belief. Well, you can't just throw yourself out. If I wrote a paper on, MRI tumor hypoxia, right? and I said, well, because there's, this thing that I did myself, therefore it proves that it works. Like, people would be like, no, you can't just throw out your own personal experiences like that. You have to defer to the evidence. Much more so if you've had a personal experience. I would think you'd be. So I respect what Dr. Allison is saying about this. I think he's a fantastic researcher. But I think when he talks about post-bereavement hallucination, his literature doesn't match up with all the literature and all the knowledge that we have about a different entity, which is persistent grief disorder. Okay, and that's not the same thing as post-bereavement hallucination. And I think we have to take a lot of that literature from the 70s and we have to throw it out, and we have to be a little more selective with what we're seeing. I think it's post-bereavement hallucinations. If you take the evidence and you contextualize it to the experience of the disciples, maybe then it's a little bit more convincing. But I still think you're taking something that we understand in a very, very different light, and you're applying it to a very, very idiosyncratic setting, which is very, very atypical for any post-bereavement hallucinatory experience. And you're only doing that because it makes atheism more likely. So why, you have to start with what the science actually says. And personally, why is Dale Allison even weighing in on psychiatric phenomena? Why is he doing that? Like, he should be like, I'm okay with, if Paulogia had said, there may have been some psychological reason why Peter had a hallucination. I think, broadly speaking, that's something that's very hard to deflect. But when he says, "Oh, it is very in line with post-bereavement hallucination," I would say, "Wait a second, you gotta have more mental health expertise." No psychologist, no psychiatrist, no mental health professional has ever verified in the scholarly literature that the experiences of the disciples are similar to post-bereavement hallucinatory experiences. And I see a lot of atheists weighing in on this conversation, and I just really don't understand why. Like, just defer to the scientific literature that exists on those entities. Don't say, here's a bunch of new conclusions that fit this situation, because you don't have the expertise to make that argument. Like, I wouldn't. Anyways, all right, that's probably enough on that point.
You there?
Oh, I'm still here. Yeah, can you hear me?
Okay. Yeah. No. Yeah. So about the modern scientific literature on hallucinations, right? There is a very important thing we have to keep in mind is this: what happens to modern people. If I'm going to look at a study about how modern people interpret hallucinations, or what happens to them when they have hallucinations, right? It gives us knowledge about what modern people how they relate to hallucinations, but this is not necessarily exactly the same as what ancient people happen when they had hallucination. So what I'm getting at is, you ask, okay, why do modern people who have hallucinations don't end up believing that their loved ones have resurrected from the dead? And I think an obvious answer there is to say, well, because it's modern people, and because ancient people who have been way more superstitious, like 1,000 times more, right? And modern people know that this doesn't happen. But an ancient person, right, would have seen things in a different way. And Dale Allison actually responds to this argument in his book. He asks, okay, why does a widow who has a bereavement hallucination doesn't end up believing that her husband is back to life? Well, because her husband was not a preacher who was a miracle worker, who maybe even hinted at his own resurrection. Well, that's another argument. So that's obviously why it doesn't happen today, right? So I'm not sure this argument is very strong.
Well,
right.
I think the problem is that slips into the fallacy of presentism, where you're sort of painting with a brush of much greater gullibility. Now, I think we do have some precedents around what Peter was experiencing. For instance, we have the Jewish ghost literature, right? So we know that Jewish people believed in ghosts, right? So wouldn't Peter have just said, "Well, I saw Jesus briefly, but it was a ghost"? And I think that's akin with post-bereavement hallucinations, and that's if he even had one, which I think is still very, very unlikely. There's a long syllogism, a long concatenation of conclusions that you have to believe in to accept that the disciples actually believed that Jesus rose from the dead through this mechanism, post-bereavement hallucinations. And each step is unlikely. And so you have a concatenation of about, 8 different steps that need to happen for this belief to emerge. And I think it's far more likely that Peter, if he saw a brief glimpse of Jesus, which is the vast, vast majority of what post-bereavement hallucinations are, if he even had that sort of experience, he would have said, well, I saw a ghost. And other people probably would have said that too. You saw a ghost. You saw a spirit. You didn't see Jesus. So, and then also, why do we have no resurrection cults around, Theudas, around Judas the Galilean? Why Simon Bar Kokhba? Like, there's dozens of other figures. So this is where I think the issue with Paulogia is he doesn't really bring in any historical precedent, right? And so if he said, here's how Peter, interacted with Jesus, and here's like 5 other instances in the literature of historical times where we see this scenario exactly playing out. And the main thing that I say in my video is, even if you believe everything that Paulogia is saying, even if you believe every single facet of the minimal witnesses, argument, you have to admit that it's exceedingly unlikely, right? And the reason why you have to admit that, because it's only played out one time in history that we know of. So either Jesus was such a stellar, incredible person that he was that remarkable, which is in and of itself a very interesting point, or your mechanism is exceedingly unlikely, even if it's true. So either the minimal witnesses argument is false, or it leads you to a place where it's exceedingly, exceedingly unlikely that these mechanisms would ever play out historically, because we just don't have any other examples. So I think, you can, a lot of people, this is by far the most common argument that I see when I talk to people in the comment section is, well, in the first century, Peter was just, way more, gullible, and he was way more superstitious. And so he had this experience. So he thought Jesus rose from the dead. I still think even if you give him that, he's not going to be able to convince anybody else of that. And that still, there's several gaps in logic in that. And is there any evidence-based or scholarly reason to think that Peter was just that gullible or that superstitious, other than the lens of your own atheism? I think if your lens is like, I'm trying to justify my own atheism, then it becomes more palatable. But without that,
Yeah. I know we have a quote by Tacitus saying about how super gullible many people back then were, right? And I just normally just part of the general knowledge, right? That one thinks, oh, I bet ancient people were super superstitious, right? That's what many people see things. But let's
and I
see.
hope we get into this, but the traditions around Judaism specifically were very, very skeptical. They're very skeptical of witness testimony specifically. So again, even if Peter had a post-bereavement hallucination, even if he had a conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead, then you're still stuck with the situation of how is he going to convince anyone else of that? So,
that's next topic. So maybe we can go straight to it. That's the next point. So James, the brother of Jesus, became part of Peter's Jesus movement. Perhaps also one of the disciples named John. He also says, Paulogia also says here, assuming they came to believe in Jesus' resurrection, that could be explained by social contagion, a model of influence and persuasion. Peter's claim of witnessing the risen Jesus gave the shocked and grieving group hope, which they readily accepted due to bias, predisposition, and the power of Jesus' message. Peter's influence, group dynamics, and cultural factors convinced them of the resurrection through faith, just like every Christian believer since, right? So basically he's saying that Jesus was the only one who really had a vision or a hallucination, and he went to the other ones and told them, I saw Jesus alive, he has risen, and they went along with it. They believed it because they would want to believe that. That's something that they would heavily want to believe. They would be in shock, like how could the Messiah die like this? They would be like in a massive state of shock, and this is a belief that they would have wanted to be true in a way. So that's the explanation here of why the other people came to believe in the resurrection. Yeah. What would you say about this?
I mean, again, there's a lot of hand waving here, and some of it is intentional vagueness. But you have to at least, if I were putting this in a journal, and I said, well, I mean, even Paulogia sort of ends this point with saying the possibilities are endless of what might have happened. But how does a social contagion work? What are the precedents in history where somebody's convinced somebody else of a theology through social contagion? We don't really have any examples. Most social contagion situations that we know of are emotional, most of the literature around social contagion has to do with like if somebody around you is happy, you're more likely to be happy. If somebody around you exercises a lot, you're more likely to exercise. That's
Oh,
how social contagion. Oh, go ahead.
I have one example. What about Salem? Don't you think that's maybe a good example of this? Salem witch trials.
Oh, the Salem witch trials.
Salem, yeah.
Um, yeah, I haven't researched that much, but but were there any new theological beliefs that arose from the Salem witch trials?
Okay.
I don't. I mean, I think the claim that somebody is a witch is been around since antiquity. I think that's misogyny has been around since antiquity. I think it's easy for misogyny to slip into like you know very pejorative statements about women in general. So I think that's a kind of an easy transition. Not to say that it's justified at all, or that this is. And by the way, not to say that the Salem witch trials were not horrific, um, but I mean, let's go back to the disciples' experience and how Peter could have convinced them. So we talked earlier about the Jesus apocalyptical sayings. Now, one of the things that we have in those sayings is where Jesus says, "No one can know the hour or the time." I'll explain how this is relevant in just a moment. No one can know the hour or the time. Now, the reason why I think Jesus actually said that is because that's a statement from the Jewish literature. Where does that statement come from? That's actually Jesus quoting the Jewish literature about the lunar calendar, right? So the lunar calendar, which gets reset every month, right? You have to have two witnesses who witness the exact, precisely same appearance of the moon, okay? And then you have to interrogate those witnesses separately, right? So and this is a very mundane claim, and this was in fact a monthly ritual. So every month, the Jews would go through this process. And by the way, Deuteronomy absolutely says if there's even a mundane civil legal matter, you should have at least 2 to 3 witnesses. So to me, if I'm a Jew in the first century and Peter says, I saw Jesus, my inclination, and this is not through the lens of modern skepticism, my inclination is I'm going to say, so what? Lots of people see lots of things. That doesn't move me at all. And maybe Peter convinced a couple of people, but would the movement have risen so quickly? Would have become so pernicious so quickly? We know that very early on in Christianity, it necessitated not only a response, but a lethal response. That amount of a lethal response suggests that it was a big enough movement. I don't know if Peter could supply that by himself. By the way, in a 2016 blog post, Bart Ehrman himself says that probably the original number of Christians was 15 to 20 individuals. And Alex O'Connor, who's a very, very strident atheist, obviously, recently said in a video that he thinks that something very unusual happened on Easter morning that gave rise to a Christian community. Now, I just don't see Peter being very persuasive. Moreover, Peter had 3 years of theological experience under Jesus. Before that, he was a fisherman. I don't see him being able to convince a lot of Jews. He's not a rabbi. He has no theological training. He never had a ministry on his own. We don't see during the time of Jesus that, Peter makes a bunch of speeches alongside Jesus. So we don't see Peter as a practiced orator. We don't ever see him being particularly persuasive until after Jesus dies. So I just think, why would a bunch of Jews like throughout tradition about witness testimony, throw about all the skepticism, and this is not like whenever there's a trial, this is every single month, the Jews knew that if there's a new moon, you have to interrogate 2 people, you have to interrogate them separately. And, so I think if 2 people come up to me and say, we both saw Jesus, I'd be like, okay, I'm going to ask you some questions and I'm going to ask you some questions separately. And I think that still is a very difficult thing for me to accept as a first century Jew. Moreover, there would not have been an expectation that Jesus would have risen from the dead. There was not a practice of resurrection. And Jesus had been dead for 3 days. This is a very important facet because that's well beyond any time where somebody could recover from like sort of a near-death condition. So if they said somebody looked like they were at death's door and then they came back 3 days later, that's very, very unlikely in the Jewish literature. The Sadducees didn't believe in resurrection at all. The Pharisees believed in resurrection only as an eschatological event. So there are so many factors working against Peter, and I just don't see, Peter ever being able to convince anyone of this, much less a large number of people, much less a large enough number of people to be a significant issue in Rome, something like, about 15 years later. So we know that this group started, with a group. We knew it spread very quickly. I just don't see Peter as being that convincing to that many people that quickly. I just and there's a lot of hand waving that happens here. Yeah, Peter convinced James because of mechanism. Social contagion happened because of mechanism. And then the worst thing is, by the time you get to fact 10 about Paulogia, Peter gets yeeted out of the whole situation. So I'm like, you just spent everything like fact 7 of Paulogia's mechanism. Peter, okay, then there's a lot of theological embellishment, and nobody ever checks in with Peter again. Wait a second. He's the main person carrying all this stuff. And now you got him yeeted out of the situation. I just don't see. I would have loved to. I think the only analysis that Peter is convincing comes from hand waving. Social contagion is a broad term. We don't really understand it. As a causal mechanism around Peter, we have no precedent. So, as hand waving, you could say it, and I don't have a problem with that, but just at least admit that it's hand waving. And at the very least, I think you have to admit that it's improbable.
Yeah. I could admit that it's like something a priori improbable, right? But never say something similar to Alex O'Connor and say, okay, maybe one have to say something weird happened, right? A weird accident of history happened, which was unlikely, but it somehow ended up creating this big religion that became so popular so fast and so so extremely, right? But I don't see it as a huge problem because I don't need it to happen. Something is improbable. It may not happen every day, but I only need it to happen once in all of human history, right? So it could happen, right? So I don't see like it's a huge issue, right? One will have to look at exactly how improbable it is, right? There's a point where it is too absurd, right? But what the skeptic will say here is always the same. Will say, "Oh, but a man rising from the dead is even more improbable, right?" He's always going to do. Is going to boil down to that, right?
Absolutely. And this gets to the strength of Paulogia's argumentation. I think the main strength is it gets you out of the resurrection. So I've talked to people who are like, I don't really care how improbable this is. It gets me out of the resurrection. If that's your standpoint, I can't really argue with that. If you say that the resurrection has a 0% chance of happening, then there's any number. I could come up with about 12 different mechanisms that explain all of the minimal facts that don't require a resurrection. I could time travelers, aliens. I could say that Jesus had a hidden twin. Now, nobody believes that, but yeah, there was a twin that Jesus had. He came into the situation. He switched places with Jesus. They stole the body. Maybe he was a fraternal twin, so people didn't recognize Jesus right away. And then they took some convincing to be like, oh, this is actually Jesus. And then he escaped the situation before he could face any consequences. That's at least, it puts everything together. I mean, I think that's as convincing as the minimal witnesses argument. But so when Paulogia argues for minimal witnesses, I think his argument is, look, I've come up with this, and it's at least a remote possibility. If that's your argument, that I'll take any infinitesimally small probability above the resurrection, I can't argue with that. Okay. Now, the two things I want to say about that is, number one, this remote concatenation of plausibilities that are playing out is just so unlucky that it happened after the life and teachings of one of the most influential people in history. And that's why I think this whole argument misses the most important point. If you watch my minimal facts video, it starts with fact number 1, that Jesus was an interesting moral and intellectual individual, right? Because let's say you came up to me tomorrow and you said, Joseph Smith resurrected and he appeared to me and I saw his body, and here's 100 other people who saw Joseph Smith. I would say that's really good evidence. What did Joseph Smith tell you? Well, I mean, I've read the Book of Mormon. I don't want to pejorate any LDS members, but I just don't think there's anything in there that's that theologically interesting. So that's the real problem to me, is that all this stuff happened that's all very implausible around this person who was really brilliant, who was philosophically, theologically, spiritually, morally very, very insightful, who resonated with different thinkers to this day. Tolstoy, War and Peace, that was inspired by Jesus. That inspired the nonviolent movement. Gandhi, Martin Luther King, massively inspired by Jesus. Hannah Arendt, who wrote about the banality of evil, one of the most important political scientists of last century, was inspired directly by Jesus. Soren Kierkegaard, the father of existentialism, he took his ideas directly from Jesus. He writes of that very specifically. So Jesus is intellectually a massively important figure. If you had way, way more evidence about Simon Bar Kokhba resurrecting, we have a lot of writings from Simon Bar Kokhba. I'm probably mispronouncing his name. But the point is, none of those writings are compelling to me at all. And they're not compelling because he doesn't have anything interesting theologically to say, right? It doesn't, if he resurrected, I would say, well, that's interesting to me, but it doesn't really matter to me. So, and the second thing that I want to say is, and this is really important, if Paulogia's argument is this is very, very implausible, but it gets us out of needing a resurrection, I understand the appeal of it. That's a very appealing argument. I can definitely understand that. But the problem is that when he argues for it in a way that he says this is very plausible that this happened, right? He says post-bereavement experiences can explain why the disciples started believing in a resurrected Jesus. And the other problem is many atheists who argue for this mechanism argue that it is very plausible, that it makes sense, that it's very palatable. And I have to say, like, well, and just admit that it doesn't work very well. Because if you're just saying, well, anything but the resurrection, then yeah, you can accept anything that's absolutely preposterous. And, Jesus could have been yeeted out of the time frame through a quantum fluctuation. I think, there's not a 0% chance of that. It's an infinitesimally small chance, but, it gets you out of the resurrection. So this becomes sort of a flawed standard, but it's important to at least recognize that the minimal witnesses argument, if it's true, is at the very least highly, highly improbable and implausible. So you shouldn't say, I believe in this because I think it's a really, really good explanation. You should say, I believe in this because I just don't want to believe in the resurrection. And if that's what you believe, I think you're totally justified. So I can't argue with that. If you're like, but at least admit, number one, it's implausible. It doesn't work very well. There's some logical gaps in it. There's a lot of hand waving, and that it just happens to be very fascinating. This happened after the life of one of the most insightful individuals possibly who's ever lived. So anyways,
I'm trying to find an example here. I know I read about in Kolmanowski's book, one example of social contagion or cognitive dissonance leading to a new belief. Let me check something here real quick. Oh wait, no, not this one. Oops. Where was this? Yeah. So about cognitive dissonance is also part of the story. It's about how humans tend to believe something because they want to rationalize something else. And the idea behind it is that the disciples wanted to rationalize how Jesus could die since he was the Messiah and all of that. And the way they came up with is to say that, well, he was supposed to die and resurrect, right? And one example he gives, I forget the name, but it's I think it's called Mennonite or something like that. It's the sect that later became the Latter-day Saints or something like that. The story is that there was a bunch of fake prophecies, like they predicted that the world will end one day. It didn't happen. They went to believe some different things, some rationalization, right? Later, this other prediction didn't happen again, and they went to believe something else, right? So it's like they somehow managed to convince themselves of something despite obvious evidence that their theological beliefs were false, right? So that I forget the name of the sect, but when you say, okay, we have no examples anywhere in history of something similar, I'm like, no, I think many cults or sects will be examples of similar things. Maybe you want something that is very narrow, very similar to Jesus, right? But that's like missing the point a little bit. Also, when I think about Salem, the Salem witch trials, right? I think that's a great example of social contagion can make people believe all kinds of things, right? You say that people didn't develop a new theological belief out of it, right? But I think like, okay, so what, right? I mean, the point is that they believe some extraordinary things, like there are witches attacking them and flying in the air. We have people testifying that they saw demons talking to the witches, or witches with their familiars, or witches casting spells and stuff like that, right? So I do think there are some comparable examples of this kind of phenomena happening. What do you think of this?
Yeah, my point against Paulogia is that it's not that we don't have any precedent. It's just that his argument is made in the absence of a historical precedent. So he never advocates for a historical precedent. So, I'm happy to talk about what was the first example that you gave, the evolution of Mormon beliefs.
Yeah, I
Again,
don't remember. I was trying to find the name in my phone. How was the name? Mennonites or something? No, I forget because I had it in this book. I read it in this book about.
yeah, I admit I don't know a lot about the origin of Mormonism, but
Yeah,
here's the problem. I do know that when you make a prediction and it doesn't come true, that your belief system dissipates and that decimates your belief system. Okay,
yeah,
so if you have, we have lots of examples of people making predictions about the end of the world, right? And then those end of the world predictions don't happen, and the movements always have at least some loss of credibility, some loss in their population, right? So by your own definition, Jesus should have suffered big losses in his population, but instead we see a growing population. So I don't even mind that, like, if you say, Peter actually believed in Jesus. He believed that it was impossible, that Jesus should not have been killed. There should have been a Messiah. He should have been the Messiah. He should have brought about the kingdom of God in a very literal way. And you say, well, then the problem was he had cognitive dissonance afterwards. Well, there should have at least been a drop off in the followers of Jesus. But instead, what we see is throughout the first century, we see an accelerated expansion of Christianity in the face of several factors that would work against that belief system. By the way, I mean, I think we have to keep in mind the context where people were getting punished for this belief system. Now, the Jews didn't technically have the authority to execute people, but they did have the authority to essentially stone people to death,
yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say I found what I was talking about.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah,
It's
yeah,
a,
yeah.
it wasn't the Mormons. It was a cult called the Seekers who predicted the end of the world in 1056, and it's a very famous thing. There is a book about it called "When Prophecy Fails," and it's about a
Yeah,
modern.
yeah, 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 yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's not the Mormons. I had it mixed up in my head. So it's about they predicted the end of the world. They failed many times, but they each time they managed to convince themselves that there was some misunderstanding or whatever. Right? Like it doesn't matter when the evidence disproves your beliefs. They still find a way to rationalize things. Right? That's what the argument was making. Yeah.
That's
Sorry.
true, but we
Go on.
know
Yeah.
from that historical precedent that each time that happens, there's a drop off in membership, right?
Yeah. Okay.
So people do leave those movements from historical precedent. Not always, but there's almost always at least some drop off. Okay, so I think the precedent argues in the fact that if Jesus had been a failed apocalyptical prophet and had said, "I'm never going to die," and then he ended up being killed, and there was this expectation that he should have survived, would there be a recontextualization? Yes, probably, but there would have been a drop off in the movement. And I don't know that you would have had the conflagration around Christianity that you would have had. So, and I specifically don't know that if Peter is the only one who has that confirmation, which is kind of what you have to believe the minimal witnesses model, that's enough to convince anybody of anything. In other words, you're not talking about a movement here. You're talking about Peter being essentially the main torchbearer of the belief that Jesus resurrected. Now, if you have, I'm trying to think of a way to salvage the causality. Like, let's say you had these people all saying, well, Jesus died, we're all very depressed, we're all gonna go on a spiritual journey together. And they all consumed maybe some sort of ergot alkaloid or something. And then Peter was the one who guided them in the spiritual journey. And he said, look, Jesus has reappeared. There he is. And they maybe an hallucinatory. I mean, I still think you're throwing in a lot of things, but at least it's a more palatable mechanism. So I'm not saying the minimal witnesses argument can't be salvaged. I'm just saying that you have to add something to it, right? And right now, all you have is hand waving. This argument that the belief in the resurrection was social contagion. I'm not saying it's false. I'm not saying that's a false argument, but I am saying that you have to just kind of give yourself over to a lot of hand waving to accept it.
Okay. So maybe we can move on to the next
Yeah.
point. So, yeah, stories about Jesus spread to person evangelism with the focus on recruiting new followers rather than accurately transmitting historical events. So, yeah, basically what Paulogia wants to say here is that the people were telling stories about Jesus, and that they felt free to change things and to embellish things and to add details to make them more impressive, to all the miracles, or whatever, right? That's what this point is trying to say. That's what happened back then. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
So
again, I think there's a lot of hand waving here. I don't think there's, there's what. Okay, for instance, why were people incentivized to evangelize? Were they incentivized to evangelize about, a cause that they had no stake in? We don't have any explanation for that. Why did people start to abandon? I want to pull up the wording that Paulogia uses, because he says specifically that Peter was no longer around to check the beliefs that people had. So the factual grounding that Peter once had wasn't important anymore. I'm trying to find where he actually says that. All right.
yeah,
Well,
well,
okay. Stories about Jesus spread through person-to-person evangelism. Why? Don't know. With a focus on recruiting new followers. Why were they trying to recruit new followers? Were they incentivized somehow? Don't know.
because
No mechanism. Rather than accurately transmitting historical details. So all of a sudden now they don't care about historical details anymore. Well, that doesn't sound like Polycarp. That doesn't sound like Papias. That doesn't sound like Irenaeus. That doesn't sound like any of the Aristides of Athens. Quadratus. Justin Martyr. They were all very interested in historical details. So why did historical details no longer matter? This history no longer mattered. Details were later embellished and invented to remove obstacles. Why? Why did they get rid of the details? And the narratives most successful at winning converts were repeated. Well, how did they track and measure this? There's no infrastructure, so we don't know this. As the movement grew, he says Peter was not personally present to confirm or correct the adopted narratives. So now they've yeeted Peter out of the situation after the last three minimal facts had Peter like being the main carrier of this mind virus idea, the social contagion. So now after Peter's the sole carrier, he gets yeeted out of the situation. And by the way, we know that Peter died in I think the mid 60s. So we've essentially lost the one linchpin in the equation. And again, I don't see that we have any rationalization for this. And by the way, this also, like, I did a whole video on all the early advocates for Christianity, including Aristo of Pella, including Tatian, including Papias, Polycarp, Irenaeus. And you have this very interesting tradition in Christianity that people were advocates for Christianity. You don't find this in any other religion, by the way. Christianity is the only religion that has this, where there are early advocates within the first 150 years of Christianity who were not themselves part of the Christian hierarchy. There's three individuals. There's Athenagoras. There's Justin Martyr, right? These people, I think the other one is Aristides himself. Yeah. These are all people who had no relationship to the church hierarchy, and they all wanted to spread the message of Jesus. I find that to be at least very interesting. We don't see a parallel for that in any other religious tradition. So, I mean, I understand the ideas spread, they were later embellished, but why and how? And moreover, we know that early on the resurrection belief started with a belief in the resurrection, right? We know that there was a pre-Pauline creed. So we know that wasn't a later embellishment. So you at least can't erase, you can't invent the resurrection narrative by later embellishment. I think that's a very, very tenuous argument. I don't think any scholars make that argument. I think scholars sort of endorse the idea that the resurrection was, at the very least, we have probably about 11 different pre-Pauline things that show up in the Bible, right? So different statements that predate the era of Paul. So I think it becomes a very tenuous thing to say, well, this is, there was just a bunch of later embellishment that threw this idea, and the resurrection emerged out of that. I think you could say, I think, let's say what Paul says, this 500 individuals, could that be a later theological embellishment? I think that's probably a theological embellishment, even though that's sort of an early on creed. I think a lot of arguments around like the birth narrative. I think by that point, around, there was so much time that passed between Jesus and people writing down the birth narrative, right? Because Jesus was around the year 30 CE. So presumably the birth narrative was around the year 1 CE, right? So you have like 30 more years to work with in which embellishment can occur, but again, we don't really have a mechanism for it. It's a lot of hand waving, and we have a lot of factors that work against it. And we don't really explain why people were no longer interested in historical details. And if you buy that people just gave up on historical details for whatever reason, which is never explained, then you still have the problem of why are all the writings that we have about from early Christians in the first 150 years intensely interested in engaging in historical details? Like Justin Martyr cites the acts of the apocryphal acts of, or not the apocryphal acts, but the acts of Pontius Pilate, right? So people are always appealing to a living witness tradition. Quadratus cites the fact that in the year 200, there were still people alive who, who at least knew of this tradition of living people who had been healed by Jesus, suggesting that those people lasted until the time of Quadratus at least. So I mean, I think it's, I'm sorry, I think Quadratus was writing earlier than that. I think, yeah, he was writing the year 120 CE. But anyways, my point is there's a lot of writings that are very, very historically grounded. I did a whole video on this. So it's counter to everything that I know about early Christian literature. And there's no really real compelling reason to accept it, other than it bolsters the minimal witnesses argument. But then your argumentation becomes circular and you're just trying to justify your own atheism, which is fine if that's what you want to do. But admit that you're adopting a conclusion that's implausible is my only suggestion.
Yeah, I think in general, the general reason to accept this will be something like, because this is what normally happens with cults, right? I think this will be the idea behind it. Like, you ask, why are they doing evangelism? Well, because that's what cults do. They try to get other people to join their cult. This is like normal cult religion stuff, right? And I'm sure we need a special reason to justify
Well,
it.
not really, because most cults dissipate after the primary figure dies, right? If
Yeah.
the whole Jesus movement was a cult, we would see more cult-like behaviors, first of all. And second of all, we don't see, cults are very insular, right? They don't usually move around geographically. We don't have itinerant cults that form very easily. And the reason for that is because if you're moving around, you're exposing your populace to different cultures and different ideas, right? We don't really have a lot of cult-like teachings by Jesus. We know that Jesus was stunningly insightful if he was a cult leader. And we also know that the cult of Christianity probably more than likely should have collapsed after the decapitation of the movement by the killing of Jesus. So, there are cults, so we know ideas can spread, but I don't think that really suggests that these ideas meet the same parallels.
Yeah.
At the very least, if you say, well, we know that ideas spread with cults, and maybe this was somehow an example of that, I think that's implausible. But again, you should just say, I know it doesn't really work very well. I know it's not a very good explanation, but it justifies my atheism, and that's really the main goal that I have. I think that's what your standpoint is. I don't know that I can convincingly argue against that.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, I mean, some cults do disappear, right? I mean, most cults do disappear, but there are also some that had like surprising success or growth. Like, for example, Mormonism, right? Mormonism started as a small cult or thing. I would call it a cult, right? Just a small religion, but grew really fast. And today is millions of people, right? I mean, like sometimes they get lucky, so to say, right? In a way.
Yeah, I mean that's sort of a different argument than saying this spread because it was a cult, and we can actually look at Mormonism and see reasons why it spread. But again, I mean, to me, that's why my minimal facts sort of focus at least on some component of Jesus being an insightful teacher. If you have no interesting ideas, then it doesn't really matter how convincing your religion is. For instance, I've actually done a pretty deep dive into the tablets of Mormonism. There's 11 witnesses who said they saw the tablets and lifted them up. I think there probably were tablets. I don't think that's a stunning claim. I think there's a lot of skeptics who don't believe in the LDS religion, who believe that those tablets were physically present at some point. They could have been made as a prop by Joseph Smith, but I mean, I believe somebody saw some tablets. I don't think that's, I think it's very interesting that like Joseph Smith was like, okay, look at the tablet, now write down an affidavit that you saw the tablet. Like to me, I don't want to get off too many tangents here, but to me, if God came to me and was like, Tavo, you have to go to Domino's and give this message to this person, I'd be like, okay, thank you, God, I'll do that. And then if he was like, okay, great, now could you sign this affidavit that just verifies that I was here? I'd be like, okay, you're divine being and you want me to like sign an affidavit? Like, it's like, you want me to sign a witness statement under penalty of perjury? There's like a lot of legal language in this witness statement, God, that you're like, I'm like, oh, well, God is a very shrewd attorney is what I would say at that point. So anyways, I think you can make the argument that other belief systems have spread. I think that are any of those arguments applicable to the minimal witnesses argument? I think, I will say this: we've studied a lot of movements that have dissipated after decapitation. Decapitation is the process of killing off the head of a movement. What happens after those movement that the leader gets killed off? The majority of those movements collapse. Okay, across the board, political movements, religious movements, the majority of movements across the board all collapse. Can movements survive decapitation? Absolutely, 100%. But there have to be factors that explain why that movement survived. For instance, the Islamic religion didn't collapse after Muhammad, right? The reason why it survived, though, is because there were protocols for handing off the leadership. The same is true of Mormonism. Mormonism didn't collapse, but Joseph Smith built an infrastructure. He built an organization. There were people to carry on the beliefs after he passed away. So I think I'm not saying it's impossible, but I'm saying that you have to be able to explain it if that happens. So if decapitation doesn't work, which is the minority of cases, then you have to explain why it didn't work in stamping out a movement. And I think social contagion and Peter is not and post-bereavement hallucination is not an adequate explanation for why the movement of Christianity would have survived.
Okay. So maybe we can move on to the next point. Oh, yeah, this is about Paul. So Paul, a Pharisee who had been persecuting the new Christians out of a sincere belief that he was serving God, experienced a non-veridical vision of the allegedly resurrected Jesus. Right? So basically, where he's positing that Paul just had an hallucination at some point of Jesus appearing to him, and this was strong enough to cause a full conversion to Christianity, and that's what happened with him. So, what do you think about this?
Yes, several problems with this. Paul had post psychological distress from guilt that resulted in hallucinations about Jesus. Well, again, there's a lot of hand waving here, right? Why did Paul's conversion may have served as a coping mechanism to resolve his turmoil? Well, we don't really see that anywhere in the literature. How we have about 20,000 Nazis who committed war crimes. They were all very refractory. It's very uncommon. I know of one Nazi who actually had a guilt-induced psychosis. Okay, he was actually a newspaper editor. He never killed anyone. And that's the only Nazi that I could actually find who had guilt-induced psychosis. Now, this shows up in what's that movie with Shelter Island, right? And it shows up in Black Swan and The Machinist is another movie. So we know about guilt-induced psychosis mostly from the fictional literature. In reality, guilt-induced psychosis and guilt inducing a psychotic state is not something that we find in the medical literature. Almost always when you have a brief psychotic disorder, it's almost always superimposed on some existing psychiatric or psychological comorbidity, okay, that's longstanding. And it's not brought on by guilt. It's brought on by maybe a really acute stressor. And guilt can act as an acute stressor, but we don't see a lot of guilt. And when that happens, though, you really don't have a lifelong delusion. In other words, you don't have a lifelong theological conversion. I just think, again, there's no mechanism here. There's a lot of hand waving. We don't know of any guilt-induced psychosis. We don't know of anyone who is guilty of, antagonizing a population who then converted to that population's belief system. None of the Nazis converted to Judaism. I mean, there were actually some Germans who converted to Judaism out of guilt, but we know a lot about that population. We know that none of them were really Nazis. So why was this something that happened with Paul that never happened before in history? I think, again, I understand it logically makes sense, but it's just extremely without precedent. And the problem is there's a lot of hand waving. And the problem is it contradicts everything we know about psychiatric illnesses. And it's also probably important to note that Paul had what is theologically an unprecedented experience. There are no antagonists that I could find in any other religious traditions who then subsequently became believers and converted to that belief system and were martyred for that belief system. We can find antagonists who then converted. We don't find any antagonists who converted and were subsequently martyred. Moreover, we definitely don't find antagonists who were initially antagonists, later converted to that belief system, and wrote primary components of that belief system themselves. So Paul being a primary author of Christianity is, I think, at least very unprecedented. So now Paul himself sort of separates out his veridical visions about Jesus from non-veridical visions. So he believes that he sort of has, communications from Jesus and sort of hints and brief visions, but he had one experience that he believes was veridical. Now, Paulogia's main argumentation about this is we know more about that from Acts, and there's some conflicting testimonials in Acts. I've done a deep dive into some of the other stuff from Acts, so I don't know if that's too many. There are too many details I want to get into here. Now, we're pretty close to 2 hours, so I know there's some other minimal facts, but I think we've done a pretty good job of talking about most of them. Yeah, I'm happy to keep going through them, but do you want to have like a bit of a wrap-up conversation just so we can like...
No, I don't know. Yeah, we can keep going. Go over all the items if you want. I mean, if we go over 2 hours, it's fine.
Let's go through the other ones quickly and see if there's. Do you want to pull up the article and see if there's anything that we really feel compelled to talk about? Let's just kind of.
Yeah.
Because I know people don't tend to watch videos. They get longer than 2 hours.
Yeah. We got Saul. We got Paul met Peter and John, but they didn't see eye to eye. This one is not like, it's nothing big about it. Or do you have any comment here?
No, I'm willing to, like, in the interest of time, kind of skip over
that.
I will say that the problem is that Paulogia cites Galatians in this. I think the context that he's citing is pretty clearly about circumcision, which is a much more tenuous thing to,
Yeah.
And then that's minimal fact number 10. Is that the last minimal fact in this article?
I think it's 12.
Oh, there's 12. Okay, yeah, let's keep going. Yeah.
So, several decades later, Greek-speaking individuals who had never met Jesus or Peter began documenting the circulating stories about Jesus, the sayings attributed to him, and their interpretations of these narratives. So he's saying that it's about the Gospels. He's saying the Gospels were written by people who have never met Jesus, who were not eyewitnesses to this. They were just Greek-speaking individuals that later heard these stories. That's basically the idea here.
There's good literature that John was aware of the earlier synoptic gospels, and he doesn't, I mean, there's inconsistencies, but he doesn't frankly contradict them. I think you have good grounding that John later advises Polycarp, Papias, and Irenaeus, through Polycarp and Papias. We have at least some documentation. There's some elders of the church in addition to John. We have some documentation that there's this other follower, this other disciple of Jesus, Aristion. So, I don't know that I buy this as being a complete gap in the logic. So, in other words, is there any narrative gap? Now, we do know that the narrative of the New Testament hasn't essentially changed from the year 200 to the modern times. If you look at P45 and P46, they both date from around the year 200, and they're both not significantly different from the King James Bible. So, in other words, we have this kind of 18 to 20th century tradition of Christianity not changing that much, right? So you have to sort of interpolate a period where these documents were tremendously fluid, where these traditions were tremendously fluid. Now, the other thing that I go into in greater length in my video is there any reason to believe that the oral tradition would have significantly changed the gospel arguments in such a short time frame? I think you only have a window that's fairly short, a window of about 30 years where this can actually happen. And I think oral tradition is strong enough to withstand a 30-year gap. Ehrman makes a lot about like how these stories changed year over year, decade after decade. But I think that's really a gap. We know that there was a lot of veneration for the original gospel traditions. I'll tell you, in the 2nd century, we know about this writer Tatian, who wrote the Diatessaron, which is a harmonization of the Gospels. So we know that there was some pushbacks, and people wanted to say, let's get rid of the Gospels because they contradict each other. Let's instead have this different narrative that we can just harmonize. We can say this is the canonical narrative, and instead of taking something that would probably be more palatable, that would mitigate the biggest argument against Christianity since that time, which is the inconsistencies, which have been the biggest argument against Christianity essentially since the 2nd century. And yet they didn't do that. So that to me says that even from the early church founders, even going as far back as Papias and Polycarp, who were getting their teachings about Jesus directly from John, that there was a high degree of veneration of the original gospel traditions, which suggests that they would have been able to be transmitted. We also know from Luke, by the way, that there were early gospels that were lost. So the fact that we don't have any surviving documents in that first 20 to 30 years, um, we know that Paul has the Final Supper narrative in his document, in his writings that he talks about, and we know that it didn't originate from Paul. So, and we know that for instance, Mark chapter 14 and chapter 15 in the Gospel of Mark is a pre-Markan tradition of the Passion. So there are a lot of facets of the narrative of Jesus that were not just simply embellished in that first period. But again, I don't know that this gets you out of the resurrection, even if you accept that this is true, right? We know that the resurrection was an early belief. So even if you believe that there were later theological embellishments, which is, I think, a separate argument, I don't know that that mitigates the actual resurrection narrative. I also don't know that that really provides you any explanatory power in that first 5 to 10 years of Christianity, which would have been one of the most difficult transitions for them to manage by everyone's definition.
Okay. Yeah. I will only say here briefly that I have read Bart Ehrman's book, Jesus Before the Gospels, when he talks about oral traditions and whether they change or not. And what he says, the argument he makes is that some studies do show that these oral traditions do change, like year after year, when people do retell stories. That when you compare them, they people actually do change those stories. I mean, he has made that case, right? I don't know if you have heard any of this.
It kind of depends. I believe that some of the stories were likely changed. Like, for instance, I'm very willing to give up on, like, what was it, Matthew 27:52, where saints come out of the ground and get resurrected. Like, I'm happy to give that up. But I think that's much more likely to be a later theological embellishment that was invented to harmonize, the resurrection of Jesus with other predictions that the Jews might have had at the time, to say, yeah, this was more like the events described in Ezekiel. But again, I think the core narrative is going to survive. We have a lot of examples from history of oral traditions that communicated important information over a much larger expanse of time. The Icelandic sagas, they commit a lot of what we know about Viking history that we can verify through archaeological evidence. We know those were passed down orally as well through Icelandic traditions, and we can see that those actually line up with what we know about the Vikings from other traditions. We know about ancient Central African narratives, right? We have some archaeological evidence, and we have oral traditions that grew independently from that archaeological evidence. And we know that those independent things do line up; they do harmonize. So we know of things that lasted a long time. I know Bart Ehrman's arguments fairly well on this point. But again, I don't think that gets you out of the early spread of Christianity, the early palatability, the early conflagration around Christianity. I don't think it gets you out of explaining away the resurrection. Like, in other words, and also I think that gets you from the Gospels to Tatian's Diatessaron. I think that's reasonable. But again, we don't follow Tatian's Diatessaron. We follow early Gospel traditions. I also think that this ignores the fact that there were probably some proto-Gospels. I think some oral traditions were carried pretty well. And then if you take the proto-Gospels, you really only are working with a gap here of about 30 years. I mean, I remember, let me put it to you this way. I think a better analogy for how things could have changed is, let's say right now you waved a magic wand and you erased all the music from the 90s. Would we still be able to reconstruct that music? We would lose a lot of music from the 90s if you erased it. But I mean, I can write down the lyrics for about 200 songs that I have memorized. I met a guy recently who memorized the entirety of the Quran orally. So I think oral tradition can be very powerful, especially when there are mnemonic or creed-based devices behind it. So I think you can argue that some things are theological embellishments. I think Bart Ehrman's analysis on this point is very convincing. I don't know that it necessarily directly supports Paulogia's argumentation, and also I don't know that it gets you to a point where you can wholesale invent a lot of the central theology around Christianity, particularly the resurrection narrative itself.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Maybe we can take a look at this point. Okay, so it's about persecution of Christianity.
Yeah, I'm willing to, if it helps, I'm willing to just sort of agree to these last 2 points, because it's been 2 hours, and I know people won't watch, and I tend to kind of peter out a little bit after 2 hours. But I don't, unless there's anything specifically that you think I ignored in my analysis on these
No,
points.
no. I think we can just wrap it up. He just, well, yeah, we can. I can reduce the speed a little bit so that you increase the speed so that it will be around 12. But it doesn't. It's not a big.
Oh,
It
that's
won't
good.
make
Yeah,
a huge
that's fine. Yeah,
difference. It won't
yeah,
make a huge difference. The last point, but we can just do this last point. He's saying basic. Occasionally, some early Christians engage in disruptive behavior and face consequences as a result. However, early Christians generally live peaceful lives, having facing little ideological persecution. So basically, what Paulogia is doing, he's trying to address the argument that Christians face all this kind of persecution over the belief in the resurrection. And what he's trying to do here is trying to say, okay, actually, it wasn't that much. It wasn't that huge of a deal. Persecution has been exaggerated a little bit. That's basically what Paulogia is saying. So, do you have any comment about this?
I think Sanhedrin 43a says that there were 5 other followers of Jesus who were killed. Right? We know that the Jews had a lot of authority to penalize people. They couldn't execute people by the Roman letter of the law, but they could stone people, and people could die from that stoning. And frankly, the Romans didn't care if they really executed people. So I think the execution of Jesus would have been harder for the Sanhedrin to pull off without the consent of the Roman government and without Rome kind of stepping in a little bit. But I think that there would have been a lot of penalties for believing Jesus. You have to remember, Gittin 57a from the Jewish literature says that Jesus will forever be submerged in boiling excrement. Now, this is very acerbic phrasing that the Jews reserve for very, very few people in their literature. They talk about Jesus this way, and the rest of the enemies of Judaism they talk about this way are not individual prophets who are heretical. They're not, they're kings who executed Jews and attempted genocide against the Jews. So if you read a lot of Jewish literature about who are the enemies of the Jews, I've kind of gone on a deep dive of this for a lot of interesting reasons, mostly to see if there's any parallels of Jesus. Like, are there other heretical teachers who are treated so acerbically? So I think even if you read the Sanhedrin 43a as just a non-historical document, you still have to understand it does expropriate for the Jews the authority to at least have punishment against people who follow Jesus. I think also if you read all the other Jewish literature about Jesus, there was a lot of Jewish authority to punish people. We know that authority didn't really start diminishing until it probably started diminishing in the year 100, in the year 60. It started diminishing a little bit. Maybe in the mid 60s, it started diminishing a little bit more. We know by the year 70, the Jewish authority in the region decreased quite a bit. And we know by the year 130, with the uprising of Simon Bar Kokhba, the Jews were essentially yeeted out of power by the Roman Empire at that point. But we do know that there was a lot of authority to persecute these early believers. I'm willing to go ahead and accept that, by the mid 40s, by the way, Christianity gets to Rome, and the Christians are exiled from Rome by the mid 40s. This is a very short time frame. So I'm willing to sort of paste in that gap of what we don't know between the mid 30s to the mid 40s by saying, well, there probably was some persecution during this time period. If you're saying the Christians weren't persecuted during that time period, I'm willing to fall back a little bit on the New Testament evidence. I don't generally like to cite the New Testament heavily, but I'm willing to sort of paste it in because it's so congruent with what we know about what happened in the mid 40s through the mid 60s in Judea and also throughout the Roman Empire. So we know that by the mid 40s, the Christians in Rome were such a huge problem that they were forced to be exiled from the city of Rome. So we know that there was at least that degree of persecution, that there was exile. And I'm willing to accept that, James, son of Zebedee, and Stephen Martyr, who were killed in the book of Acts, maybe those weren't real individuals, but I'm willing to accept that they probably, represent real narratives and real historical trends that were happening, just because it lines up so well with the Jewish literature, and it lines up with so well what we know about the mid 40s. There was a lot of persecution, and we know that certainly in the mid 60s there was a lot of persecution that we have very, very solid documentation of by Tacitus. So there are very few gaps in time to me that are difficult to explain where Christianity was not persecuted.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Yeah, what I know that some skeptics like Candida Moss, they have
Oh,
also
sure,
made a
yeah.
case trying to say that this whole persecution thing is vastly exaggerated, that the stories are a historical, that it wasn't that much of an issue, but we have to look at in detail at all these sources to see how historical they are, right? But yeah, I think there was probably some persecution taking place, like to some degree. I mean, maybe not a huge degree, but you cannot deny, you cannot say there was no persecution at all, right? You have to grant some degree of persecution of Christians early on.
Yeah, I think Dr. Moss's argument is most persuasive when you look at, did Nero persecute Christians for political or theological reasons? I don't think Nero was particularly theologically motivated, but that doesn't mean that the Christians weren't persecuted. It just means that his personal motivations were, he was like, we already have this class that's reviled. We can scapegoat them for this big fire that happened in Rome. And so I'm going to scapegoat them. I'm going to persecute them even more and keep the people from blaming me. I think those were Nero's motivations. I don't think he was particularly theologically or ideologically motivated for that matter. But I think that doesn't mean the Christians weren't persecuted. I think that just means that his motivations were more nuanced than, I just hate Jesus so much. I agree. He didn't really care. He probably has his own political motivations. But we know that by then, at least, Christians were a reviled class, and I don't think he could have created this much antipathy for the Christians ex nihilo. He probably just sort of piggybacked his own interest on this general public antipathy that people had towards the Christians.
Yeah. So the last thing is, I think we can. The last thing is nothing much important. It's just saying that it's nothing controversial. It's just saying that later on, Christianity was temporarily allowed in Rome, but later gained legal protection, and at some point became the official religion of Rome. So that's it. That accounts to how do we get Christianity what it is today. That's just, I think that's relatively uncontroversial. So that's the end of it. Or do you have anything to say here? I don't know.
I mean, it wasn't a linear process. Certainly, we know that Emperor Julian did try to outlaw Christianity again. He was more interested in paganism. He tried to revive Judaism. He tried to reconstruct the Third Temple. I did a video recently on this, and these, interestingly, one of Julian's historians, Ammianus Marcellinus, documents that there were these fireballs that came out of the ground and burned a bunch of people when they were trying to build the Third Temple. So I think that's sort of an interesting historical account in and of itself, but probably not relevant to this video.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, I want to check it out later. What was the original source actually say, what kind of literature that is, because that's interesting. Yeah.
Do you think Paulogia is ever going to see this and respond to it? Do you think he's going
to? I don't think, honestly, I don't think my channel is big enough for that to happen. To be honest, it's not. Maybe if it was a bigger channel, maybe he will, but I doubt it really.
You got a great channel. Your channel's really huge. You've had Richard Carrier on a bunch of times. Yeah, these are big name people.
Yeah.
You've had, and now you have Tavo Sanabria on. That's going to explode your channel.
Yeah,
that's exponential great. Explosion now.
Yeah. So no, I don't think so. I doubt it. Wait, I know. I saw his video, one of his videos responding to Dale. I know he watched your video on Real Seekers. I know he watched that because he actually quotes, he shows a part of that video. Actually, he responded to Dale on Gary Habermas, and one part of the video he shows is actually your show with Dale when you respond to the minimal witness hypothesis. So he already knows all of this stuff. I don't think so. I don't think he's going to respond to that, because usually you want to respond to bigger channels, right? You don't want to I'm going to respond to this really small channel talking about me. No, you don't have time for all of that, right? You want to focus on bigger names usually when you are that big. So yeah.
Sure, maybe. But I saw that he quoted Dale. He doesn't. I don't think any of the clips that he has on there include me speaking at all. But I saw that he quoted Dale. I saw my picture was on there.
Yeah,
I was
that's
wow.
right.
I was like, to be honest, that was a huge compliment for me. I put that on social media on blast as much as I could, and I was like, wow, it's to be briefly mentioned by Paulogia, even though he didn't actually even say my name at any point. It was just I was like, wow, it's a huge compliment.
Yeah. So we kind of think we can wrap it up here. Do you have any final words on it you want to say about, in general, or Paulogia's hypothesis or the things we talk about?
My final overall assessment is very positive. I think if Paulogia hadn't done this, there would be people who would be asking fewer questions about these historical events. And I think that would be really bad. So I think, I've learned a lot by engaging in this, and Paulogia has increased my engagement. So I don't think that's ever a bad thing. I've been in a lot of churches where I've asked questions, and the answer is you shouldn't be asking about these things. And I think that's it's a myopic strategy in the long run. That's going to get more people to be like, it maybe helps in the short run. It helps people to not be exposed to atheists in the short run. Like if your short run strategy is to just paint Paulogia with a huge intellectual scotoma, and that's your strategy about advocating for Christianity, just hope people don't find his channel. I think that's an ill-advised strategy, and it prevents people from being intellectually nourished. If there is a God, and if that God is Jesus, then I think at the very least, like Jesus would be like, yeah, I want people to love God with all their minds, and you're increasing intellectual engagement. So I'm really grateful for the intellectual journey that I've had. And Apologia has been a huge part of my journey ever since I was really an atheist, which is not that long ago. So I guess my question for you is, does this conversation move the needle for you on anything theologically and on the minimal witnesses argument specifically?
Uh, yeah, I would have to think about it. I'm not sure it moves the needle very much, to be honest. Because for me, I always go back to like, it always boils down to saying, okay, like the skeptic scenario is unlikely, right? But I always just think like, okay, but are you saying that if my scenario is unlikely, then your scenario wins by default, right? I always think like what I said earlier, the scenario of Jesus being actually the Son of God and coming to earth and doing this in this specific way, that seems also very unlikely to me, right? So I'm not sure it moves the needle very much, right? To be honest. So that's
Yeah,
how
and I can see that. I can see somebody saying it's so unlikely that anything theologically ever would happen. To me, the arguments around the plausibility of Christianity involve, number one, the fact that Jesus was such a resonant teacher. I think could a human have been that insightful? Yeah, it's entirely possible. But at least that opens the door for thinking more about Jesus and for considering the arguments more deeply. Number one. Number two, I think there's my favorite arguments around for Christian theology are arguments that come from simulation theory, right? Is the universe a simulation? I think we have very, very good evidence that the universe is very, very likely to be a simulation. If a simulator created the universe, is there a chance that they would have incarnated into our reality to live out the lives of one of their simulations? I think that's very, very easy to argue, right? I think
yeah.
if humans create a simulated universe, what are the odds that we would never enter that universe as a simulation? Probably almost zero, right?
I don't know. What if it sucks compared to this universe? Maybe you don't want to enter.
Well,
I don't know.
I mean, like video games,
Yeah, yeah,
like it's what are the odds that we're going to invent a video game
sure.
that is completely immersive and never play that video game? You
Right,
know,
right, right.
I mean, so that to me is I go into a whole thing why the Trinity sort of lines up with what I think is compelling about simulation theory. But I'm very theologically uncommitted. Alex O'Connor recently did that video about is Christianity more plausible
Yeah,
than I thought. And he said, yeah, Christianity is more plausible than I initially gave it credit for. And I would argue that my experience since I've had the channel, if I had to make a video right now, it would be, is atheism more plausible than I originally thought? And I would
yeah,
argue, I started off as an atheist. I kind of moved into the direction of reluctant belief. I'm now sort of, I'm definitely theologically uncommitted, but I think people have on my channel commented so often on different arguments for atheism that some of I have to admit that some of their rationalizations are plausible. But I think the argument that Jesus, I think I can see somebody not buying that Jesus resurrected. I can't see somebody not looking at this whole debate and saying there's at least enough evidence that I need to pick up the New Testament and see why George Bernard Shaw, Thomas Jefferson, Gandhi, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Hannah Arendt, so many other people were so massively influenced by Jesus. I think that to me is the real outcome, that I think any reasonable person would hear this debate between you and I and say there's at least enough evidence here that I need to look for myself, and I really definitely need to specifically, engage in these readings with a fresh mindset, and that's the only result that I hope would be from any of my videos.
Yeah, that's cool. Okay. Yeah, thank you. Thank you for coming. Think you can now finish the video. So, uh, guys, thank you for watching. I will be adding a link to Tavo's video, the minimal witness hypothesis, so you can go check out his channel. Also, subscribe to the channel if you're interested in these topics. It's a very good channel, and yeah, please subscribe to my channel as well. And see you next time. Bye.
Juan, thanks so much for having me on. You've got a great channel. I've seen hours of your videos. They're all really wonderful. I'm super honored to be on your channel. This is very nice of you to have me on, and I'm really very grateful. And when this video comes out, let me know, and I'll put it on blast to all my followers. I'm super grateful to be here.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I will let you know. Okay.
Yeah, sure.